For 30 years, Kenny Rogers lived a double life. To the world, he was the polished icon who always seemed firmly in command. But when the cameras shut off, he became someone entirely different. A man navigating private battles, guarded controversies, and relationships he could never quite hold together. And in the final chapter of his life, he finally acknowledged the heartbreaking regret he had carried in silence for decades. Kenny's public persona. For most people, Kenny Rogers was exactly what he appeared to be: the easygoing country gentleman with the silver beard, the warm eyes, and a voice that could make even the simplest story feel like a life lesson. His public image felt so natural that fans rarely questioned it. He seemed like the kind of star who never let fame distort who he was. However, this was just the version of himself he wanted the world to see. You see, long before he became the face of mainstream country music, Rogers took time to understand the power of persona. In the late 1960s, he stepped into the spotlight with the First Edition, a group that blended rock, folk, and psychedelic influences. His years with the band gave him national visibility, and by the time he shifted into a solo career in the 70s, he had learned how to connect with an audience in a way few artists could. Everything changed in 1977 with the release of Lucille. This song captured what people would come to expect from his songs: a strong narrative, a sense of lived experience, and an emotional depth that felt both personal and universal. This was pure storytelling, and Rogers leaned into that strength so effectively that it soon became his signature. From that point forward, his public persona became one of his greatest assets. He cultivated the image of a wholesome, approachable country gentleman and made sure it was never presented as an act. Kenny understood that authenticity didn't require revealing everything about himself. It required consistency. And so he gave audiences a version of himself that was dependable, kind, relatable, and wise without being pretentious. This wisdom became his defining trait. His raspy, textured voice carried a sense of experience, even when he was singing something simple. Fans across generations heard him and felt like he understood them. Older listeners connected with the maturity in his tone. Younger listeners connected with the sincerity. It was a rare universal appeal, and it quickly made him one of the most trusted voices in American music. But none of it would have worked without the look. By the early 80s, the image was fully formed. The silver hair, the neatly trimmed beard, and the warm smile that looked the same whether he was on stage or doing a talk show interview. It was polished but credible, timeless but distinct. This visual consistency helped boost the personality audiences already believed in, making him look like the steady hand in a chaotic industry. This public image seemed to work out perfectly because Kenny Rogers went on to sell over 120 million albums worldwide, a staggering figure that placed him among the best-selling male artists in music history. Well beyond country alone, he became a staple not just on country radio, but also on pop charts and international playlists, reaching listeners who had never heard a country record before. His ability to cross genres without losing his identity was almost unheard of at the time. The awards followed, and they weren't just tokens of popularity. His 3 Grammy Awards, 6 Country Music Association Awards, and 8 Academy of Country Music Awards marked him as someone who had reshaped the landscape of the genre. His induction into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 2013 simply confirmed what the industry already knew, that Kenny Rogers had become a cultural figure whose influence stretched far beyond his own catalog. His signature songs became embedded in American life. The Gambler wasn't just a hit, it was absorbed into the language. People used phrases from the song in everyday conversation, even if they never listened to country music. Islands in the Stream, his duet with Dolly Parton, became one of the most recognizable duets of all time. Lady, written by Lionel Richie, proved his crossover power. And songs like She Believes in Me and Through the Years cemented his place as a storyteller who understood relationships, aging, regret, and devotion in ways audiences trusted. His persona extended beyond music. When he starred in TV movies based on The Gambler, he reinforced the very identity that fans associated with him. The films kept him visible to audiences who didn't follow music closely, adding another layer to his public presence. Another key piece of his image was generosity. Rogers supported numerous charities throughout his career, often quietly, without drawing attention to himself. His involvement in humanitarian efforts strengthened his public reputation as someone who carried himself with integrity. Although it wasn't a marketing angle, this personal choice aligned perfectly with the image he had built. Yet he wasn't afraid to take risks. In the 1990s, he co-founded Kenny Rogers Roasters, a restaurant chain that grew rapidly in its early years. This company revealed a side of him fans didn't always see, a businessman willing to experiment. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Kenny Rogers' public identity was its longevity. Over 6 decades, from the 1950s to the 2010s, he remained relevant in a way few musicians do. Trends shifted, industries changed, but the persona held steady. The wise storyteller, the comforting presence, the man who understood life well enough to sing about it simply and truthfully. And yet, behind that dependable exterior, the calm voice, and the familiar smile, there were private struggles he rarely let the world see. His public image was solid, but it wasn't the whole story. Not even close. The private struggles. For all the calm confidence Kenny Rogers projected on stage, his private life carried pressures he intentionally hid from the public. He understood the value of a polished image, and he protected it carefully. But privately, Rogers wrestled with choices, insecurities, disappointments, and personal losses that shaped him just as much as his success did. Some of these struggles were visible only in hindsight. Others he addressed openly later in life, once the truth became impossible to ignore. One of his most visible challenges came from an unexpected place: cosmetic surgery. In the early 2000s, Rogers made a decision he would later regret deeply, and it was to undergo a procedure on his eyelids. He hoped it would create a younger, refreshed look, something he felt the entertainment world quietly demanded of aging stars. But the result altered his appearance in a way that he felt distanced him from himself. Rogers spoke openly about it years later, describing the regret simply as a personal mistake born from pressure and vulnerability. For a man whose public identity depended so heavily on being the trusted face of The Gambler, this experience became a small but meaningful symbol of the tension he lived with. He knew who he was internally, but the world had expectations, and staying true to himself wasn't always as easy as it looked. The pressure to maintain a timeless image was only one layer. Rogers also faced financial setbacks that contrasted sharply with his enormous success. The most notable example was Kenny Rogers Roasters, the restaurant chain he co-founded in the 1990s. The business launched with impressive momentum. It expanded quickly, gained national attention, and at first looked like the start of a new chapter, a rare case of a musician turning an entrepreneurial idea into something genuinely promising. But the restaurant world is unpredictable, and the chain's early success proved difficult to sustain. Competition intensified, expansion outpaced stability, and the long-term costs exceeded the rewards. Eventually, the company collapsed in the United States, leaving Rogers not only with financial losses, but also with the public perception of a failed business venture. He never tried to hide it. Instead, he accepted the outcome as another risk that didn't work out. But the episode added a complicated layer to his personal story. He had been known for near-perfect consistency, and this failure stood out as a reminder that success in one field doesn't translate automatically into another. The most difficult struggles, however, were emotional rather than financial. Over a career that spanned more than 60 years, Rogers experienced the loss of close friends, collaborators, and fellow musicians who shaped the arc of his life. The country music community is tightly knit, and many of the people he worked with in his early years were also people he cared about deeply. Producers, songwriters, and performers he respected began to pass away, one by one, as the decades moved forward. Some were longtime collaborators. Some were legends he admired. Others were part of the creative network that supported his career behind the scenes. Each loss carried personal meaning, and he spoke occasionally about how these deaths reminded him of how quickly time was moving. Fame often shields the public from these moments, but for Rogers, they were markers of an era gradually disappearing around him. Even his relationship with Dolly Parton, one of the most important friendships of his career, carried a quiet emotional burden. The two remained close, but as people around them aged and passed away, the loss of shared collaborators, including members of Parton's own creative circle, affected him more than he ever expressed publicly. These weren't simply professional setbacks. They were reminders of how much of his life had been spent on the road, in studios, and on stages, surrounded by people who understood him in ways few others could. Losing them wasn't just painful. It created a sense of isolation that only grew stronger with age. But perhaps the most consistent struggle he faced was the one almost every long-running entertainer eventually confronts: the pressure of fame itself. Kenny Rogers built a persona that fans loved: the gambler, the mentor-like figure, the country gentleman who always seemed relaxed, friendly, and composed. But maintaining that image required discipline. It meant showing up to interviews even when he was exhausted. It meant touring relentlessly, sometimes to the point of burnout. It meant carrying the expectations of millions of people who saw him not just as a musician, but as a symbol of reliability in an unpredictable world. In private, he often admitted that the weight of that identity could be overwhelming. The touring schedule alone took a physical and emotional toll. He spent years moving between cities, managing performances, recording sessions, and public appearances. The exhaustion was real, even if he rarely let audiences see it. He acknowledged moments of insecurity, wondering whether he could keep up, whether the persona still fit him, and whether he had the energy to deliver what fans expected. These pressures didn't dim his love for performing, but they added complexity to a life that looked effortless from the outside. Kenny Rogers was proud of his work and grateful for the opportunities it brought him, yet he navigated a constant tension between the man he truly was and the version of himself the world embraced. For decades, those private challenges stayed mostly behind the curtain. Fans saw the hits, the awards, and the confidence. But underneath it all were the missteps, the sacrifices, and the emotional costs that rarely make it into headlines. And those challenges were only part of a much larger, more complicated picture. Because some of the toughest moments of his life weren't private at all. They were public, polarizing, and sometimes shocking. Kenny Rogers' controversies. Throughout his long career, Kenny Rogers faced criticism and personal missteps that complicated the clean, dependable image audiences associated with him. One of the most persistent criticisms he faced came from within the country music community itself. As Rogers transitioned from traditional country toward a softer, pop-influenced sound in the late 70s and 80s, many purists believed he had diluted the genre. His biggest hits were beloved by global audiences, but they were also the songs most frequently cited by critics who felt he had abandoned the pure country sound that defined earlier decades. For Rogers, the issue wasn't rebellion, it was artistic instinct. He gravitated toward songs that emphasized storytelling and melody, even if that meant crossing genre lines. Still, the criticism weighed on him. He often said he wanted both commercial appeal and the respect of his peers, but that combination was difficult to secure once his music leaned heavily into crossover territory. The awards kept coming, but some industry tastemakers held back praise, creating an undercurrent of tension that followed him throughout his peak years. Even though he believed in the choices he made, the perception that he had sold out lingered long after the hits faded from the charts. But his most personal controversy happened in the early 1990s when Rogers became involved in an intimacy-related scandal that quickly became tabloid material. Though the details were sensationalized in the press, Rogers himself acknowledged that the situation damaged his reputation at a vulnerable moment in his life. The incident coincided with the breakdown of his fourth marriage to Marianne Gordon, which intensified public scrutiny. At a time when his personal life was already under strain, the scandal created additional pressure and exposed him to a level of media intrusion he rarely experienced. He later reflected on that period with regret, recognizing how close he came to losing the trust of the audience he had spent decades building. Another part of Rogers' past that occasionally resurfaced involved illicit substance use during his early years in the music world. Like many young musicians in the 60s and 70s, he experimented with substances that were common within the industry at the time. His experiences were nowhere near as extreme as those of the era's notorious rock stars, but they contributed to the broader rock and roll lifestyle that often accompanied touring and performing. Rogers didn't glamorize these choices, nor did he dwell on them in interviews. He simply acknowledged that he had been part of the culture around him before maturing into the steady figure audiences later embraced. By the time he reached the later stages of his career, most of these controversies had faded from public memory. His long-term consistency, his catalog of hits, and his reputation for kindness overshadowed the missteps. And while these controversies created turbulence in his career, they were modest compared to the struggles in his private life, especially when it came to love, commitment, and the challenge of keeping relationships together while living in the constant rhythm of fame. Kenny Rogers' turbulent love life. Kenny Rogers' career was remarkable, but his personal life was far less stable. The same ambition that drove him to the top of American music often clashed with the demands of marriage, family, and long-term commitment. He was open about this tension, never trying to hide the fact that his work came first for many years. The result was a complicated romantic history marked by sincere intentions, genuine affection, and a pattern of relationships he struggled to sustain while living under the weight of fame. In 1958, at just 19 years old, he married Janice Gordon. It was a relationship defined by youth more than compatibility. They had one daughter, Carol Lynn, but Rogers later spoke honestly about the challenges that surfaced almost immediately. Arguments came easily, patience came slowly, and he later recognized that he entered marriage before understanding what it required. By 1960, the relationship had ended. He accepted responsibility for the split, describing himself as too young, too inexperienced, and too uncertain about who he was to make a marriage last. After the divorce, Rogers didn't remain single for long. Later that same year, he married Jean Rogers, beginning a relationship that would last only 3 years. The marriage had no children and unfolded alongside the early stages of his musical ambitions. He was trying to define his sound, shape his identity, and find his place within a rapidly evolving industry. This focus left little room for a stable home life. He spent long hours working, rehearsing, performing, and navigating the financial instability that came with trying to make it in music. Rogers later acknowledged that he approached the marriage with good intentions, but the realities of his career ambitions took priority. The relationship ended in 1963, and he moved forward with clarity about what success might cost him. His third marriage, however, marked a turning point in both his personal life and his career. In 1964, he married Margot Anderson. By then, Rogers was beginning to gain momentum as a musician. His talent was recognized more widely, and he was transitioning into a role with the First Edition, the group that would give him his first major platform. With Margot, he had a son, Kenny Rogers Jr. And the marriage lasted 12 years, significantly longer than his first two. But those 12 years were also the period in which Rogers' professional life began accelerating into something much larger. Recording sessions, tours, television appearances, and increasing travel meant he was often absent from home. As his popularity grew, the demands on his time became constant, and family life inevitably shifted to the background. Rogers was aware of this imbalance. He later said that the marriage ended in 1976 because his career had overtaken everything else, leaving his home life unsettled and increasingly distant. He didn't blame his wife for the split. He blamed the momentum of the life he had built. Just 1 year later, in 1977, Rogers married Marianne Gordon, an actress known for her work on Hee Haw. Their relationship unfolded during the pinnacle of his fame, the period when The Gambler, Lady, Lucille, and Islands in the Stream turned him into one of the most recognizable musicians in the world. This was the life he had always wanted, but the pace was relentless. Rogers toured constantly, filmed television specials, acted in movies, and maintained a public presence that required discipline and energy. He and Gordon welcomed a son, Christopher Cody Rogers, and for many years, their marriage appeared steady compared to his previous relationships. They built a family life that worked around the rhythm of his career, and the partnership lasted 16 years, his longest before meeting Wanda Miller. But even this marriage eventually broke under the weight of fame. The couple divorced in 1993, and Gordon received a publicized settlement of around $60 million, a figure widely reported at the time. Despite the financial headlines, Rogers described the separation as amicable. He said he cared deeply for Gordon and respected their years together, but he was also blunt about why the marriage ended. He was gone too often, and the schedule that sustained his career made a sustainable marriage nearly impossible. It was a pattern he had seen before, one he regretted but had difficulty changing. Everything shifted in 1993 when Rogers met Wanda Miller in Atlanta. She was working as a hostess at a restaurant where he dined, and their connection grew quickly. The relationship drew public attention because of the 28-year age difference, but both insisted that the bond they shared outweighed the criticism. Rogers later said that Wanda understood him in a way no one else had, and that their compatibility was immediate and undeniable. They married in 1997, and this relationship marked a new chapter in Rogers' life. By then, he was no longer chasing career milestones at the same pace. His touring schedule slowed. His priorities shifted. He had already cemented his legacy, and he approached life with a steadier sense of what mattered most. With Wanda, he welcomed twin boys, Justin and Jordan, in 2004, and he frequently spoke about how fatherhood in his later years brought him a sense of balance he had long been missing. Rogers often said Wanda was his soulmate, not in a dramatic way, but with the clarity of someone who had lived enough life to recognize the difference between compatibility and chemistry. She brought calm into a world that had previously demanded constant motion. Their marriage endured until his death in 2020, and she was with him through the final years of his life, offering the stability he had never fully found in earlier relationships. But even in those later years of stability, Rogers still carried the weight of regrets and choices he wished he had handled differently, and those regrets became especially clear in the final chapter of his life as he faced the years leading up to his passing. Regrets and tragic passing. As Kenny Rogers moved into the later stages of his life, he became more open about the decisions he wished he had handled differently. He had achieved nearly everything a musician could hope for, but the personal cost of that success stayed with him. He often said that the biggest regret of his life wasn't a career choice. It was how much time he spent away from home. The touring, the television work, the albums, and the obligations of fame took priority for decades, and he acknowledged that his earlier marriages might have survived If he had stepped back sooner, he never placed the blame on his partners. Instead, he pointed to his own ambition and the pace he chose to keep. He also discussed his choice to undergo cosmetic surgery, something he later described simply as a mistake. The procedure changed his appearance in a way he felt distanced him from the image fans recognized. Age, he realized, was something he could have embraced rather than challenged. Despite those regrets, Rogers approached his later years with an unusual sense of gratitude. He often said he felt fortunate to have lived the life he lived, even with its complications. He appreciated his fans, the musicians he worked with, and the opportunities that kept arriving long after most artists would have faded from public view. Above all, he was thankful for Wanda Miller, his fifth wife, who brought stability into his life after decades of imbalance. Near the end of his life, the contrast between his public image and his private reality became sharper. The world still saw the smiling legend with the silver beard, the storyteller who always seemed sure of himself. But privately, Rogers was wrestling with the same challenges many people face as they grow older. His health was declining, his body was slowing, and his sense of time was shifting. That division between public and private self had always existed, but it became clearer as he aged. Yet he spent his final years working to reconcile those two sides. With Wanda and his twins, Justin and Jordan, he created a quieter home life that balanced the noise of his earlier decades. By 2017, Rogers accepted that it was time to retire. After more than 60 years in music, his body no longer allowed him to perform at the level he demanded of himself. His farewell tour, The Gambler's Last Deal, gave him a chance to say goodbye on his own terms. He spoke about retirement publicly with calm acceptance, presenting it as a graceful step away from the spotlight. Privately, the decision was harder. Ending a career that had defined most of his life meant acknowledging that age and illness were catching up with him. The energy that once seemed endless was no longer there. In the final years after retirement, Rogers faced serious health issues, including bladder cancer, which weakened him and gradually reduced his ability to remain active. Very little of this was shared publicly. He and his family chose privacy, preserving the dignified image that had defined his career. When he entered hospice care, it reflected how much the illness had affected him. But the family maintained the quiet, respectful distance he always preferred when dealing with personal challenges. Kenny Rogers passed away on March 20th, 2020, at the age of 81. He died peacefully at home, surrounded by Wanda and his family, the people who had become the center of his life after decades defined by constant travel and professional demands. The announcement described his passing as due to natural causes. Fans around the world responded with a mix of grief and gratitude. Tributes came from across the music industry, from country legends to pop artists who had been inspired by his versatility. Many remembered the songs that had become part of American culture, while others spoke about his kindness, professionalism, and willingness to help younger musicians. His family grieved privately, holding on to the version of him the public didn't always see. In 2023, Wanda Miller released Life is Like a Song, a posthumous album of previously unreleased tracks recorded during the later years of his life. The project showed both sides of who he was. It honored the artist who never stopped creating, even when his health declined, and it represented the husband and father whose family wanted the world to hear the last pieces of music he left behind. Kenny Rogers lived a life full of contradictions, yet in his final years, he managed to bring those contradictions into balance. He enjoyed the comfort of family, accepted the limits of age, and closed his career with dignity. His passing marked the end of an extraordinary chapter in American music, but the impact of his work and the humanity behind it continues to resonate with millions who grew up hearing his stories in song. And even in death, the two sides of his life remain intertwined. The legend remembered by the world and the man remembered at home. What do you think about Kenny Rogers' double life? Drop your answers in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.